In the last episode of this series, we covered the rise of the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great and its expansion into Anatolia and the eastern Aegean, including the predominantly Greek-speaking region of Ionia. Though much of Ionia prospered under their new overlords, in 499 BC, the Ionians revolted with the help of their allies, including the city-states of Athens and Eretria. By 493 BC, what became known as the Ionian Revolt had been crushed, and order was restored to the western fringes of the Persian Empire. However, the empire's king, Darius I, vowed to punish Athens and Eretria for their involvement in the uprising. Herodotus tells us, "When it was reported to King Darius that Sardis had been captured and burned by the Athenians and Ionians, it is said that he was unconcerned about the Ionians, knowing well that they would not escape retribution for their revolt. But he asked who the Athenians were. When he learned the answer, he called for his bow, nocked an arrow, and shot it into the sky. As the arrow sailed towards the sun, he said, 'O Zeus, may I have my vengeance upon the Athenians.' He then assigned one of his attendants to say to him 3 times, whenever dinner was set before him, 'Sire, remember the Athenians.'" Despite Herodotus's dramatic account, Darius doesn't seem to have been too concerned about the Athenians and Eretrians, at least not enough to have personally led a punitive campaign against them. These 2 city-states, situated just across the Aegean from the Persian frontier, were no match for the military power that the Great King had at his disposal. Still, an example had to be made of them, so that others wouldn't be emboldened by their disruptive actions. And so, in 492 BC, Darius ordered an invasion of Greece to bring Athens, Eretria, and any others deemed to be threats or troublemakers to heel. The man he chose for this task was his nephew, Mardonius, son of Gobryas. Herodotus goes even further to claim that Darius's ultimate goal was to take as much of Hellas as possible. He wrote, "Those 2 cities were the professed goals of the expedition, but what the Persians really intended was to subjugate as many Greek cities as they could. And with their fleet, they subjugated the island of Thasos, whose inhabitants did not even lift a finger to oppose them, while with their army, they added the Macedonians to their already existing host of slaves. For all the peoples east of Macedon had already become Persian subjects. From Thasos, the fleet crossed over and sailed close to the shore of the mainland up to Akanthos, from which they set out in an attempt to round Mount Athos. But as they were sailing around it, a strong north wind came up on them, which was so impossible to deal with that it battered them badly and wrecked many of their ships against the shore of Mount Athos. In fact, it is said that about 300 of their ships were destroyed with more than 20,000 men. And since this sea is full of savage creatures, some were snatched up and killed by them, while others were dashed against the sharp rocks. Some men perished because they did not know how to swim, and still others died from the cold. And so that is what happened to the fleet there. The tragedy at sea meant that, at least for now, retribution against Athens and Eretria had to be postponed. Still, the expedition was not without some successes. Mardonius was able to capture the island of Thasos, which was important because of its many silver mines. Herodotus also tells us that he was able to subdue a Thracian tribe called the Brigoi. As for Macedon, its king, Alexander I, likely submitted peacefully, as there's no textual or archaeological evidence indicating any sort of armed conflict. While Macedon was formerly part of the satrapy of Thrace, its remote location on the empire's far northwestern edge allowed it to maintain significant autonomy. The writing on the wall was now clear. The Persian Empire was indeed expanding westward, and soon it would only be a matter of time before the entire Greek mainland would be affected. In 491 BC, several parts of northeastern and central Greece, along with several Aegean islands, peacefully submitted to the Great King. One of these was the island of Aegina, just southwest of Athens. The relationship between Athens and Aegina was often tense, as they competed over the same trade routes. Herodotus elaborates. After this, Darius tried to test the Hellenes to find out whether they intended to wage war against him or surrender to him. He sent out heralds in all directions throughout Hellas and ordered them to ask for earth and water for the king. And while he sent some heralds to Hellas, he sent others to his tribute-paying cities along the coast, with orders to build warships and vessels to transport horses. So the cities began to construct these ships. On the mainland, many of the Hellenes visited by the heralds gave what the Persian asked, as did all of the islanders to whom the heralds had come with the request. Included among the islanders who gave earth and water to Darius were the Aeginetans, as the inhabitants of Aegina were called. And as soon as they had done so, the Athenians assailed them, thinking that the Aeginetans had granted the king's request out of hostility to themselves, in order to march with the Persians. Herodotus reports that Darius also sent heralds, or diplomatic envoys, to Athens and Sparta requesting earth and water, but both cities responded with hostility. The Athenians had cast these heralds, when they made their request, down into a pit, and the Spartans had thrown theirs into a well, and the heralds were told to take their earth and water to the king from there. The murder of the envoys or heralds is quite shocking, for such acts would have been seen as an abomination, even by those who may have hated the Persians with a passion. In ancient Greece, heralds, regardless of nationality, were considered sacred and protected from harm. Essentially, you don't kill the messenger, even if you despise the message. This was something that the ancient Greeks believed had been decreed by the gods themselves, and wasn't to be taken lightly. To kill a herald in cold blood, as both the Athenians and Spartans had done, was to invite divine retribution. With diplomacy failing to bring Athens and Eretria in line, Darius ordered his forces in Asia Minor to prepare for war. The campaign was to be led by a high-ranking Mede named Datis and a Persian noble named Artaphernes. This Artaphernes is not the satrap of Lydia that we met earlier, but his son. To avoid any confusion, I'll refer to the son as Artaphernes the Younger. Little is known of Datis's ancestry beyond him being a Mede, though he may be the same individual as an official named Datia, mentioned on a ration tablet discovered at Persepolis, which reads, Datia received 70 quarts of beer as rations. He carried a sealed document of the king. He went forth from Sardis. He went to the king at Persepolis, 11th month, year 27. This date aligns with 494 BC, when the Ionian Revolt was nearing its end. In tablets discovered in the archives of Persepolis, only Darius's uncle and chief economic official, Parnaca, as well as the nobleman, Gobryas, who was Mardonius's father, received more rations than Datia, which helps to confirm his high status. As for Artaphernes the Younger, he was likely in Sardis with his father during the Ionian Revolt, and may have gained first-hand experience fighting against the Greeks during that conflict. In 490 BC, Datis and Artaphernes the Younger left Ionia with a large fleet of ships and set out for a targeted strike against Eretria and Athens. The exact number of ships and men isn't known, because the sources we have all contradict each other. For example, Herodotus says that the fleet contained 600 ships, but he doesn't tell us the number of men who traveled on them. The lyric poet Simonides of Chios, likely in his 60s in 490 BC, claimed the Persian force numbered 90,000, though it's unclear if he witnessed it firsthand. Plato later suggested 500,000 men, but mentioned only 300 ships. Centuries later, Roman historians like Cornelius Nepos estimated 200,000 men, while Justin records that it was 600,000. These conflicting accounts make the true size of the Persian force impossible to determine from historical sources alone. Let's assume that the ships in the Persian fleet, most of which were built and manned by Phoenicians, were comparable in size to the standard Greek trireme. In the classical era, larger Greek triremes could carry around 200 men, but this though would have included rowers, who would have made up the bulk of the crew. One also has to take into account the space, or separate ships, needed for carrying and feeding horses, which we know that the Persian armed forces utilized in the battle to come. A typical Median horse in those days needed anywhere from 12 to 21 pounds of hard fodder, such as barley, and 14 to 55 pounds of green or dry fodder, such as hay, daily. They also needed to drink at least 4 to 8 gallons of water every day. As we'll soon see, on this particular campaign, the Persians were island hopping around the Aegean, and so all the food for the horse, let alone the rowers and the soldiers, and their rations, as well as the military equipment needed for an urban assault, had to be taken on their ships. With the exception of perhaps the Lelantine plain between Eretria and Chalkis on Evia, there was really no good place where Persian and Median horses could graze. Based on our current understanding, scholars are nearly certain that the figures cited by classical and later historians are highly exaggerated. For instance, if the triremes of the late Archaic period were similar in size to those of the classical era, then the 600 ships Herodotus mentioned could, in theory, have carried an astounding 120,000 men. This, though, is highly doubtful. According to historian Dr. Peter Krentz, a typical trireme from Datis's day would have had perhaps 60 rowers and a maximum of 40 soldiers. If there were 600 triremes, as Herodotus states, then in total, the entire fleet would have comprised of 36,000 rowers and 24,000 soldiers. If the number of triremes was 300, as Plato wrote, then there would have been 18,000 rowers and 12,000 soldiers. Other eminent scholars, such as Nicholas Geoffrey Hammond and George Cankwell, put the number of Datis's forces at between 25,000 to 30,000 men. If there were more than that, then it's likely that King Darius would have personally commanded the operation. Such large numbers of men may also not have been necessary, nor advisable, for what many scholars believe was a targeted campaign to punish 2 rogue Greek city-states. One reason is that 50,000 fighting men was probably not even needed to subdue a city like Athens, or even the whole of Attica, which is estimated to have had a population of around 30,000 male citizens at the time. Eretria's inhabitants would have perhaps numbered less than half of this. Also, given the massive shipwrecks suffered by Mardonius's fleet just a couple of years earlier, it would have been extremely dangerous and a logistical nightmare to transport so many troops at once. To avoid the perilous winds that plagued the waters of the northern Aegean, the Persian fleet island hopped around the Cyclades on their way to Eretria. One of their stops was the island of Naxos, which was important because whoever controlled it could dominate the rest of the Cyclades. Although the Persians had failed to capture Naxos nearly a decade earlier, Datis and Artaphernes the Younger would succeed. Herodotus informs us, "The Persians left the Icarian Sea, and since they intended to attack Naxos first, they approached the island and put into shore there. The Naxians, remembering their previous experience, did not await them, but fled for the hills. The Persians caught and enslaved some of them, and set fire to their sanctuaries and the city. After that, they set sail for the other islands." The fleet's next stop in the Cyclades was Delos, the mythological birthplace of Apollo and his sister, Artemis. When Datis arrived, he found the island deserted, as the inhabitants had fled to nearby Tenos. Herodotus writes that he then sent a herald to Tenos to reassure them of his good intentions. "Holy men, why have you gone in flight and condemned me without good reason? For I myself have enough good sense to know, and besides, the king has instructed me not to harm the site on which the two gods were born, nor the rest of the island or its inhabitants. Therefore return to your homes and inhabit your own island again." Datis then made an offering of 300 talents, or about 7.5 tons of frankincense, which was extremely generous, to Apollo as a gesture of goodwill before moving onward to Eretria. After sailing a bit through the Cyclades, the Persian fleet arrived at the town of Charistos on the southern end of Euboea, where they encountered some resistance. Herodotus tells us, "So the Persians besieged the city and ravaged the land until the Charistians adopted the Persian way of thinking and came over to their side." The Persian fleet then sailed through the Aegean Gulf towards Eretria, the first primary target on Datis's hit list. Unlike Athens, Sparta, Corinth, or even Thebes, Eretria was a relatively small polis with a lack of fighting men. They requested aid from Athens, which sent reinforcements, specifically 4,000 Athenian colonists that had recently settled near Chalkis. However, Eretria's greatest weakness was not its lack of soldiers, but internal political division. Herodotus, once again, explains, "The planning of the Eretrians was not at all sound, for although they had sent for Athenian assistance, they were divided among themselves over what they should do. Some of them considered leaving the place and heading for the rough headlands of Euboea, while others, expecting to win personal gains from the Persians, were preparing to betray their city. When Aeschines, son of Nothon, the leading man of Eretria, became aware of this situation, he informed those Athenians who had arrived about the present state of affairs and begged them to depart for their own land so they would not perish along with the Eretrians. The Athenians followed his advice, and by crossing over to Oropus, they saved themselves. Now the Persians, as soon as they landed, they disembarked the horses and prepared to attack their enemies. The Eretrians had no intention of marching out to meet them in battle, so now their prevailing plan was to stay in the city, and their main concern was to defend its walls if they possibly could. The assault on the walls was fierce and lasted for 6 days, and many fell on both sides. On the 7th day, 2 prominent citizens, Euphorbos, son of Alcimachos, and Philagros, son of Cineas, betrayed their city and surrendered it to the Persians. After entering the city, the Persians plundered and set fire to the sanctuaries, exacting vengeance for the sanctuaries burned down in Sardis, and as Darius had instructed, they enslaved the people. With Eretria and Naxos both subdued, Datis and Artaphernes the Younger now only had to punish Athens for their mission to be complete. However, Athens was not like Eretria in that it was a much more powerful, populous, and better defended polis. That said, the single city-state of Athens was no match for the Persian force sailing towards them. Their citizen soldiers, or hoplites, were armed with 1 or 2 spears, a short sword, a bronze helmet, a round wooden shield, a corselet made of linen and leather to protect the chest, shin guards, and sandals. Some hoplites belonging to wealthier families may have worn a bronze breastplate, but most Athenian hoplites had less protection. The Athenians were also at a further disadvantage due to their lack of a significant cavalry force and navy. The Persian armada advancing on Athens boasted superior numbers of infantry and archers, including mounted archers from the Central Asian steppes, who were capable of disrupting Athenian lines before the formidable Persian cavalry delivered the finishing blow. Herodotus wrote that Persian boys were taught from an early age to ride a horse, shoot a bow, and to speak the truth. The great King Darius himself took pride in his skills as a rider and archer, as he declared in an inscription at the Achaemenid necropolis of Nakshi Rustam. As a horseman, I am a good horseman. As a bowman, I am a good bowman, both on foot and on horseback. As a spearman, I am a good spearman, both on foot and on horseback. In addition to their conventional forces, the Persians had a secret weapon, the exiled former tyrant of Athens, Hippias. After fleeing Athens, Hippias had taken refuge in Asia Minor and was eventually welcomed at the Persian court of King Darius. Now, 2 decades later, he returned to Greece to repay the favor by providing Datis and Artaphernes with intelligence and strategic advice on how to defeat the Athenians. Despite being nearly 80 years old, Hippias' motivation was clear. He sought to be reinstated as tyrant of Athens, ruling the city and Attica as a vassal of the Persian king. After the capture of Eretria, Datis rested his men for several days and gave the Athenians one last chance to surrender. The choice of whether to fight or surrender must have been a difficult one, especially with so many different political factions amongst the Athenians. This was the topic of discussion amongst Athens' 10 strategoi, or generals, and the polemarch, who was in this case a highly respected man named Callimachus. In earlier times, the position of polemarch was given to the supreme commander of the Athenian armed forces. But under the fairly new democratic constitution, the army was under the command of 10 elected generals, one from each of Athens' 10 tribes. By 490 BC, the polemarch had become more of a ceremonial position, though he was still given a say in military matters, and could also vote on important decisions, especially if there was a tie amongst the generals. Several of the generals feared that if they didn't act swiftly, factions within Athenian society, particularly those sympathetic to Hippias and his family, might defect to the Persian side. The longer the Athenians delayed, the more likely that some members of their coalition would lose the will to resist and, like several in Eretria, betray their city to Persian forces. Surrendering would have placed Athens and Attica under Persian rule, which some Athenians saw as preferable to war. For example, becoming part of the Persian Empire may have ultimately benefited Athens commercially, as many inhabitants of the Greek cities in Ionia and Asia Minor had lived under Achaemenid rule for decades and enjoyed lucrative trade opportunities and privileges exclusive to Persian subjects. And surely, paying tribute in the form of taxes, soldiers, and ships was preferable to fighting against the world's only superpower where the odds were stacked heavily against them. For many, surrendering to the great king's forces seemed to be the only way to save their city and society. In histories, Herodotus recounts a discussion between a general named Miltiades and the polemarch Callimachus, the latter who had the deciding vote as to whether or not to engage the Persians. The Athenian generals were divided in their opinions. Some were against joining battle, thinking their own numbers were too few to engage the forces of the Medes, while others, including Miltiades, urged that they fight. So they disagreed, and the worst of the two proposals seemed to be prevailing when Miltiades went up to the polemarch at that time, one Callimachus of Aphidna, who had been selected by lot for his office as polemarch of the Athenians. It was he who had the 11th vote, for in the old days the Athenians used to grant the polemarch an equal vote with their generals. Miltiades said to Callimachus, "It is now up to you, Callimachus, whether you will reduce Athens to slavery or ensure its freedom. For from the time Athenians first came into existence up until the present, this is the greatest danger they have ever confronted. If they bow down before the Medes, it is clear from our past experience what they will suffer when handed over to Hippias. But if this city prevails, it can become the first among all Greek cities." Callimachus was moved by Miltiades' speech and voted in favor of going to war. Miltiades was then chosen by the generals to lead the army into battle. Being the final target on Datis's list, the Athenians had the advantage of receiving intelligence from nearby Euboea regarding the size of the approaching Persian force and their expected tactics. In terms of size and military strength, Athens was not Eretria or Naxos. As one of the larger Greek city-states, scholars estimate that the Athenians could field about 8,000 to 10,000 troops, primarily hoplites and light infantry. They may have had even more, as a decade later, at the Battle of Plataea, Athens reportedly deployed around 16,000 men. Deciding that they would indeed make a stand against their enemy, the Athenians sent out heralds to all parts of the Greek world for other states to join them in their fight against the Persians. Most messengers came back empty-handed. Only two states, Sparta and Plataea, responded favorably. The herald dispatched to Lacedaemon was named Philippides, who upon arriving in Sparta is said to have told its leaders, "Lacedaemonians, the Athenians beg you to rush to their defense and not look on passively as the most ancient city in Hellas falls into slavery imposed by the barbarians. For in fact, Eretria has already been enslaved, and thus Hellas has become weaker by one important city." While the Spartans were willing to help, they were temporarily unable to do so because of a religious festival that prohibited military activities. They were celebrating Carneia, a festival dedicated to Apollo, during which warfare was forbidden. The festival would not conclude until the next full moon, likely too late to save Athens. The Plataeans, by contrast, had proven to be far more dependable allies. Despite being a small polis, they're estimated to have sent approximately 1,000 men to support the Athenians. Following Hippias' advice, Datis and the Persian forces landed at Marathon in September of 490 BC. Marathon was roughly 25 miles northeast of Athens. Herodotus suggests that Hippias chose Marathon because it offered the best terrain in Attica to maximize the effectiveness of the Persian cavalry. It was also conveniently located close to Eretria, from where the Persians would be arriving. Hippias knew what he was doing, having executed a similar strategy nearly 60 years earlier when he accompanied his father, Pisistratus, back to Athens from exile. They had also sailed with their supporters from Eretria to Marathon, and then marched on Athens to seize the city from its ruling aristocrats. Realizing the Persians' intentions, Callimachus, Miltiades, and the other Athenian commanders led their troops to Marathon. Reaching the edges of the plain, they camped at the local sanctuary of Heracles because, like many shrines, it was near a stable source of water and situated on higher ground. This gave them a much better defensive position should the Persian cavalry make a sudden charge. Fortifying this area also allowed the Athenians to control the coastal road to Athens. Shortly afterward, the Plataeans arrived. The Persian army was positioned about a mile away, closer to the sea. Then, they waited. The Athenians and Plataeans may have been expecting Datis to make the first move, or perhaps they aimed to avoid a Persian cavalry charge by maintaining their position on higher ground. They may have also been delaying in anticipation of reinforcements from Sparta. The Persians' delay in attacking has also been widely debated. One theory suggests that Datis, unprepared for the presence of a sizable Greek force at Marathon, was likely weighing his options for advancing toward Athens. The tense standoff lasted several days, with each side observing the other from across the plain. On September 12th, the Athenians advanced toward the Persian line. The precise reason for their charge at that moment remains a topic of scholarly debate. One theory suggests that after days of stalemate, the Persians grew impatient and advanced toward the Athenians, who were blocking the coastal road to Athens. Given his numerical superiority and cavalry force, Datis might have hoped to have lured the Athenian defenders into a decisive battle before moving on to take Athens. Another theory is that the Persians had begun reloading their men, horses, and equipment onto their ships to sail around southern Attica and attack Athens by sea. The Athenians may have thought that this may have been their only chance to slow down the Persians before they reached Athens. As for the specifics of the attack and battle formations, all we have are Herodotus' account, which provides enough detail to give us a picture of how the two armies met on the field. Miltiades is given the most credit for the Athenians' tactics, something acknowledged by both Plutarch and Herodotus, the latter who tells us, "When Miltiades' turn came, he deployed the Athenians for battle, with the Polemarch Callimachus leading the right wing. For at that time, the Athenians observed a custom that the Polemarch was always to command the right wing. Once Callimachus had taken his position there as their leader, the tribes were posted next to one another in succession according to their numerical order, and the Plataeans were posted at the end of the line, holding the extreme left wing. The result of the Athenians' deployment at Marathon was that the line of the Athenian army was equal in length to that of the Medes, but the center of the Athenian line was only a few rows deep, and thus the army was at its weakest there. Each wing, however, was strong in numbers. After the troops were in position and the sacrifices had proven favorable, when the Athenians were let loose and allowed to advance, they charged at a run toward the barbarians. The space between the two armies was about a mile, and the Persians, who saw the Athenians advancing toward them on the double, prepared to meet their attack. They assumed that the Athenians were seized by some utterly self-destructive madness, as they observed how few the Athenians were in number, and how they were charging toward them with neither cavalry nor archers in support. So the barbarians suspected that the Athenians had gone mad, but when the Athenians closed with them in combat, they fought remarkably well, for they were the first of all Hellenes we know of to use the running charge against their enemies, as well as the first to endure the sight of the Medes' clothing and the men wearing it. In fact, until then, even to hear the name Medes spoken would strike terror into Hellenes. They fought in the battle at Marathon for a long time. The barbarians prevailed in the center of the line, where the Persians themselves and the Saka were deployed. And as the barbarians were winning here, they broke through the line of the Hellenes and chased them inland. But at the same time, the Athenians and Plataeans were prevailing on the wings. In their victory there, they allowed the barbarian troops that they'd routed to flee, and then, drawing both of their wings together, they fought those enemy troops who had broken through the center. In this encounter, too, the Athenians were victorious, and as the Persians fled, the Athenians pursued them and cut them down until they reached the sea, where they called for fire and started to seize the ships. Although Hippias and Datis are said to have chosen Marathon for its strategic advantage to the Persian cavalry, Herodotus makes no mention of their involvement in the battle. This omission lends some credence to the theory that the Persians were in the process of packing up and preparing to sail for Athens. Interestingly, the Saka, a branch of the Scythians renowned in antiquity as exceptional horsemen, were likely assumed by Herodotus' audience to be armed riders, forming part of Datis' cavalry. One detail that Herodotus does give us is the number of men on both sides that were killed. On the Athenian side, 192 men met their death, including the polemarch, Callimachus. The Athenians who died at Marathon were cremated, and their ashes were buried under a large funeral mound on or near the actual battlefield. This mound, known as the Soros, still exists today. The Plataeans who perished on the field of battle had their own burial mound nearby. Herodotus tells us that the Persians suffered far greater losses, with 6,400 men killed. The burial of the Persian soldiers who died at Marathon is not well documented. About 600 years after the battle, the traveler and historian Pausanias visited the plains of Marathon and wrote the following. There is a demi called Marathon, about the same distance from Athens as from Charistos in Evia. It was here in Attica that the barbarians landed, were defeated in battle, and lost some ships as they were putting out to sea. The Athenians have a grave on the plain, and on it are tablets giving the names of the fallen according to their tribes. There is another grave for the Plataeans and also one for the slaves. This was the first time slaves fought in battle. A trophy of white marble was set up on the battlefield. The Athenians say they buried the Persians because religion universally requires that corpses should be covered by earth. But I could not find any grave, and there was no mound, nor any other marker to be seen. They just carried the bodies to a trench and tossed them in. In 1884, a topographer named Hauptmann von Eschenberg surveyed the plain of Marathon for the German map project Karten von Attica, and stumbled upon an interesting find. In his survey, he commented, "In the vineyard belonging to the Scuses, a large quantity of remains of bones was found, haphazardly placed, which seemed to belong to many hundreds of dead. I thank for the information Mr. Scuses' steward, an intelligent young Greek under whose direction the vineyard was planted. I myself dug at the edges of the vineyard and found that this area full of remains of bones extends as far as the marsh." Could these be the remains belonging to the Persians who fell at Marathon? It's possible, but the discovery of numerous bones in a topographical report written almost 150 years ago isn't enough to confirm this. Further studies of this area and its remains are essential to establishing definitive proof. A day after the battle, a force of 2,000 Spartans arrived at Marathon, surveyed the enemy dead, and praised the Athenians for their courage and victory over the Persians. Despite their triumph at Marathon, the Athenians were still in danger, as the remaining Persian forces had boarded their ships and set sail for Athens. Their aim was to capture the city before the Athenian army could return to defend it. The Persian fleet sailed around Cape Sunion and into the Bay of Phaleron, Athens' main port on the Saronic Gulf, and just 5 kilometers from the city's Acropolis. However, upon arrival, they saw that the Athenians who had fought at Marathon had beaten them there, and were already fortifying Athens in preparation for a Persian attack. realizing that an assault on Athens would likely result in heavy losses, possibly even more than at Marathon, Datis ordered his fleet to turn back and return to Persian territory. Against the odds, and with remarkably few casualties, the city of Athens had been saved. For the Athenians, and indeed all mainland Greeks, the victory at Marathon was a turning point because it marked the first time that a Greek army had successfully defeated an invading Persian force in a direct land battle, proving that the Achaemenid Empire was not invincible. According to Pausanias, Marathon is the victory of which I believe the Athenians were most proud. Indeed, Aeschylus, when approaching death, wanted to be remembered for nothing else, although he had also won so much honor for his poetry and for his part in the naval battles of Artemisium and Salamis. He simply gave his own name and his father's, and the name of his city, and wrote that the hallowed ground of Marathon and the Medes who landed there bore witness to his courage. Pausanias is referring to the great Athenian playwright Aeschylus, also pronounced Aeschylus by many. Aeschylus is considered the father of the genre of drama we call tragedy. Despite his numerous achievements and accolades as a playwright, he took the greatest pride in having fought at Marathon. His epitaph is proof of this, and it reads, "Aeschylus of Athens, the son of Euphorion, lies beneath this memorial. He died in the rich wheat country of Gela. The hallowed ground of Marathon proclaims his famous bravery, and the long-haired Mede knows about it too." Unfortunately, there is no Persian version of events at Marathon that has survived. The closest thing we have is an anecdote from the 1st century AD Greek philosopher and historian Dio Chrysostom, who remarked, "I heard a Mede declare that the Persians agree with none of the claims made by the Hellenes, but tell it like this. Darius dispatched Datis and Artaphernes against Naxos and Eretria, and after capturing these cities, they returned to the king. However, while they were lying off Evia, a few, not more than 20 of their ships, were driven onto the Attic shore, and there was some fighting between the crews and the people who lived in the place. Now, this is clearly not a true account of what happened, but a likely explanation is that the king commanded that it be spread among the peoples of mainland Asia in order to keep them subdued." For the great King Darius, the defeat at Marathon was certainly a setback for Persian expansion westward, but in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't a major disaster. It's true, at least according to Greek sources, that many of his men had died in battle. Several ships were probably lost, and Persia's reputation as an omnipotent superpower in the western Aegean had suffered. Nevertheless, it was a manageable loss. The campaign also wasn't a complete failure, for Datis and Artaphernes had achieved several of their objectives, namely capturing Naxos and Eretria. In addition, the Persians still maintained their hold on Ionia and perhaps most of the islands of the Cyclades, as well as the regions of Thrace and Macedonia. And they still controlled the greatest empire that the world up until then had ever seen. We often focus on the Achaemenids' interactions and entanglements with the Greeks, but we have to remember that the area of the Aegean was just a small part of their world. The great king still controlled nearly all of Anatolia, Egypt, parts of Nubia, the Levant, Mesopotamia, Iran, areas of the Caucasus Mountains, large swaths of Central Asia, and territories as far east as at least up to the Indus River in modern-day Pakistan. With the resources and manpower from all parts of the known world at his disposal, Darius would be able to assemble a much greater invasion force to subdue Athens, Plataea, and any others on the Greek mainland who would dare to oppose the will of the Great King of Persia. It was only a matter of time. to be continued in Part 3. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to Faria Faraji for bringing life to this project with his amazing original music inspired by different traditions from all over the globe. Definitely check out his channel. There's a link to it in the video description. I'd also like to thank the channel's patrons for making videos like this possible. These include, but are certainly not limited to, GrandKick69, Yap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Daniel Allen, Danny Van Eck, Wanix TV, Robert Morgan, Strobex, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Hurtado Correa, Michael Trudell, Leader Titan, Micah G, John Scarberry, Andrew Bomer, Connor Dolson, Krish, David R, Stephen Ball, Gabe, Monty Grimes, Franz Robbins, Cyrus Mir, Dianastra, Nimrod Nir, Hypno Sen, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Anahita Debu, Gulistan Debu, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, X, formerly known as Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.